Thanks for joining us for CBN NewsWatch. I'm Mark Martin. Today, outrage in Virginia where alleged sexual assaults by a transgender student in 2 schools have parents furious. All that coming amid the accusations of a cover-up. As radical Islam asserts its control in Afghanistan, we'll tell you about the measures that have been taken to protect persecuted religious believers. Plus, a dangerous threat. The Iranian-backed terrorist group Hezbollah promises revenge on Christians in Lebanon.
Nasrallah does have the backing of much greater powers than him when he makes threats. They are not empty.
A possible civil war in Lebanon and what it could mean for Israel and the Middle East. And how one young man left his American Muslim life for Christ by the living witness of his grandfather.
But I also saw what his relationship with God was like. So I followed my grandfather into prisons as he did prison ministry. I followed him into nursing homes as he delivered groceries to elderly people.
We'll have his story and more today on CBN NewsWatch.
This is CBN NewsWatch.
We begin in Virginia, where alleged sexual assaults by a transgender student in 2 Loudon County schools have parents up in arms. Amid accusations of a cover-up, they're calling for the school superintendent and several school board members to step down. Parents are also fed up with the teaching of critical race theory and with explicit sexual content in school library books. Tara Mergener has the story.
After months of turmoil over COVID restrictions, critical race theory, and transgender policies, there are now reports of 2 sexual assaults by a gender-fluid boy. The county's new bathroom policy and a recent change to state law are back in the spotlight. Superintendent Scott Ziegler apologizing after 2 girls reported the sexual assaults on school grounds.
I'm sorry that we failed to provide the safe, welcoming, and affirming environment that we aspire to provide.
According to the Commonwealth's attorney, the same teenager is accused in both incidents that happened months apart at different Loudon County high schools. In one, the attack took place in a girls' restroom. The alleged attacker allowed access by the school's transgender policy. Scott Smith, father of that victim, is suing the school system after being arrested while trying to confront the board at a recent meeting.
The whole thing was handled poorly.
The superintendent and the school board members insist they were not aware of the specific details of this incident until it was reported in media outlets.
Mr. Ziegler, how could have you lied to all of these parents about what had happened to my daughter?
This all brings renewed criticism on 2 controversial measures. The county's recently adopted rule allowing transgender students to use restrooms that match their gender identity, a policy supported by Virginia's Board of Education, and HB 257, a bill passed in the legislature by the Democrat majority that ended mandatory school reporting of certain crimes, including sexual battery.
So that parents aren't aware, so that law enforcement isn't aware. And I think that had a direct impact on how they handled both of these rapes.
Amid the latest fallout, one school board member abruptly resigned, and there are new calls for the superintendent to step down.
His false statement on June 22nd and his failure to keep an alleged assailant out of school are far worse and merit immediate termination.
Tara Mergener, CBN News.
The debate over the school board's policies is having a big impact on the closely watched Virginia governor's race, which is now considered extremely close. Here's a look now at some other stories in the news. Democrats believe they're close to an outline for a bill on President Biden's big spending plans. Now they're trying to come up with ways to pay for it, including dropping plans to raise taxes on businesses, but adding a new tax on investment gains for the richest Americans. The FDA has approved extending COVID vaccine booster shots for those who got the Johnson & Johnson and Moderna vaccines. And they say people can mix and match shots, getting a booster from a different brand than their original shot. And former President Trump is starting a new media business to take on big tech companies. It will have its own social media platform with an app called Truth Social. As Islamic extremism returns to Afghanistan under Taliban rule, many faith communities are hiding in the shadows, bracing for a wave of persecution. Religious freedom advocates are taking steps to help them survive, even as the Taliban and ISIS fight for control. CBN's Brody Carter has this look at plans to keep Afghan Christians and other religious minorities safe.
Since the Taliban took control in August, Afghanistan's economy is on the brink of collapse. Women's freedoms have been stripped, and people of faith, especially Christians, fear the worst is yet to come. USURF hopes world leaders will use the worsening enemy and the Taliban's political desires as bargaining chips to protect religious minorities.
Since the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan in mid-August, the Taliban has intimidated, threatened, and targeted leaders from religious minority communities.
2 months into the Taliban's rule, young fighters fill the streets of Kabul. Peace and stability are silenced by violence, including targeted kidnappings and destruction at places of worship.
In May 2021, at least 85 people, most Hazara Shia female students, were killed in bombings outside a high school.
Members of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom sounding the alarm and sharing the plight of religious minorities.
2 weeks ago, the Taliban's former head of religious police, now in charge of prisons, announced that executions and amputations would resume.
The Afghan government operates as a Sunni Islamic republic, which pressures citizens to adhere to Muslim traditions. That leaves a sliver of the populations, such as Christians, Sikhs, Hindus, and Baha'i, living in constant fear of the Taliban's harsh punishment, including execution, simply for believing otherwise.
One of us is always awake during the night, always walking around and praying. So if the Taliban should come and knock on our door, we should alert everyone.
USURF says Afghanistan's religious minorities are nearly extinct, noting the last Jew fled the country in September. The organization hopes to use the Taliban's economic problems and desire for international recognition as an open door to restore peace and equal rights for all people in the country.
And how the United States will partner with other countries to use those leverage points as a way of encouraging the Taliban to uphold their side of the agreement that was agreed in the peace process, related to inclusive government, related to human rights, and also related to protection of security.
If you'd like to tangibly help Afghanistan, USURF recommends helping the tens of thousands of refugees now living here in the States. Landlords can rent to Afghan refugees without a credit check. You can sign up to drive a refugee or even help teach English to those living in your communities. And most importantly, to pray for those facing persecution in Afghanistan. I'm Brody Carter, CBN News.
Coming up, the next volatile situation in the Middle East could land one nation in the middle of a civil war. What it could mean for Israel, the Middle East, and the world. We'll have that story when we come back. Welcome back. Lebanon could be facing another civil war. The Iranian-backed terror group Hezbollah is vowing revenge after 7 of its supporters were killed during a gun battle in Beirut last week. On this week's episode of The Global Lane, Middle East Forum Director Greg Roman explains why Lebanon is erupting and the danger the conflict may pose to Israel and the Middle East.
I think the most honest and reliable person in Lebanon today is Judge Tariq Bitar. He is the individual who has been leading an inquiry into the devastating Beirut port explosion that took place a little over a year ago, when 1/3 of the city of Beirut was almost leveled, not due to an intentional act by any surreptitious forces where they might have blamed Israel or they may have blamed the United States, but because of the sheer incompetence of the previous Lebanese government that had decided to stockpile tons of ammonium nitrate next to a fireworks factory, and eventually a chain reaction set that blast off, which when you looked at it, you could have perhaps mistaken it for a small nuclear device. Now, a year and a half later, after the query has really started moving forward, and Judge Bitar is moving forward with trying to indict, investigate, prosecute, and eventually bring to justice those officials who are being investigated for acts of gross negligence, all of a sudden, because of the fact that the main minister who would have been implicated in this act came from a Hezbollah-related political party, we now see members of the Hezbollah terror organization marching again on the streets of Beirut, threatening other Lebanese minority communities. The main target of their ire is the judge who's investigating their political allies. Now, this has not stopped Judge Bitar from going forward. And a coalition crisis under interim Prime Minister Najib Mikati has now led to the point where Hezbollah is calling for blood for those who were only defending themselves on the street of Beirut in those attacks which took place last week. So right now we're on the precipice of, I don't want to say it's going to be a civil war, but definitely an ethnic action that may take place, or ethno-religious action that may take place as Hezbollah is looking for revenge.
And it seems like Sunni and Druze and Christians are united in this against Amal and Hezbollah. This week, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah threatened Samir Jaja's Lebanese forces, saying Hezbollah has 100,000 fighters ready to take up arms. Is Nasrallah miscalculating, or is this just political theater?
I think at the end of the day, Nasrallah is speaking from a position of strength. It's not just that he has 100,000 fighters. He also has the support of Syria and Iran backing him. So before anything happens with trying to find a way in which to get out of this mess that Hezbollah has currently found itself in after having lost 7 of its terror organization, or 7 of its supporters of the terror organization on the streets of Beirut last week, you have to take into context that Nasrallah does have the backing of much greater powers than him when he makes threats. They are not empty.
And he still has tens of thousands of missiles on the southern border, targeting Israel and communities across the border. If extensive fighting begins, how likely is Hezbollah to attempt to draw the IDF into the fray by attacking Israel?
Well, this has happened twice in the past. Once in the 1976 beginning of the Lebanese Civil War, and also in the 1982 First Lebanon War between Israel and Lebanon. It was really between the Palestinians in Lebanon and Israel. But that was where the Hezbollah movement was born, out of that first round of fighting. Now, I think that you have to take into context that if Nasrallah has to face Sunni, Druze, and Christian opponents locally, and he tries to deflect by letting off the Lebanese rocket valve, or the Hezbollah rocket arsenal, which can act as a pressure valve for him, by launching attacks against Israel, Israel has threatened to turn southern Lebanon into a parking lot. This is just something that was said by a top IDF general, where he estimated that an excess of 2,000 rockets could be expected per day to land on Israel in a future Lebanon-Israel conflict. And it won't be a war between Hezbollah and Israel. It'll be a war between the state of Lebanon and Israel, since Hezbollah effectively controls Lebanon. So Nasrallah is playing with fire if he thinks that he has the ability to threaten Israel, to even attack Israel and to get away with it. I'm not sure how the other ethnic groups and religious groups factor into this. But if they see an opportunity to fell Hezbollah, they may sit this conflict out if it ever happens with Israel, and let Israel do the hard work.
I think all those groups are just tired of it all. Okay, Greg Roman, director of the Middle East Forum, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
For a look at more important trends and stories in the news, watch The Global Lane. It's tonight at 8:30 Eastern on the CBN News Channel or on the CBN News app. Still ahead, the powerful testimony of a life lived for Christ by one grandfather and how it brought his Muslim grandson to salvation. We'll have that story right after this. Thanks for staying with Newswatch. A young black man raised to be a Muslim in America finds Jesus thanks to the witness of his grandfather. His journey to Christ was told earlier this year in a series on our YouTube channel called Souls and Stories with CBN's Emily Jones and Josh Doyle of Uncharted Ministries.
What was it like, that moment that you walked into a church for a first time? How was it different from a mosque?
Yeah, I mean, when you walk into a mosque, you have designated sections for women and children and a space for the men. And so, I would come in and usually a really big space where there's already people there, prostrate on the ground. And so we're doing a series of prayers, and it's very solemn, right? It's very quiet. The only thing that you hear is you hear the call to prayer, and then you'll hear the words Allahu Akbar, right? So you hear that, and then you're practicing these things, and you're prostrating yourself and humbling yourself before God. So it feels like very much of a sacred, solemn space in a mosque. Whereas when I went into the church, it just seemed like so much freedom, right? Everybody wasn't doing the same thing in unison, but everybody was worshiping so freely with joy, seeing people sing songs to God, and that this could be, and praying that this could be, man, God can, in whatever space I'm in, he'll meet me here. And so it was a different type of sacredness that felt like so much more freedom in the way that they carried themselves before God. And so I think that was what was so attractive to me, to seeing, oh man, it seems like God cares about them exactly where they are, and he has such a love and a freedom for them that they can express themselves just exactly, they can express exactly who they are. And so I saw just a stark difference between being in a mosque and hearing the call to prayer and the solemnness of it versus being in a church, and even just honestly just having the conversations with people and talking to them was a little bit more foreign, because in a mosque, you're not really talking or interacting with other people. This is the space for you to interact with God. And so the environment of the two places is such a stark contrast.
Mm. And Tyree, there's a critical moment in your journey. You're in your car with your grandfather and you're debating who God is. What did you discover in that moment?
Yeah. So I think in that conversation, what I had been taught growing up was, Allah is God and Allah means God, and this is how we serve him, right? And so all the times that I had grown up going to prayer and all those types of things, my grandfather's here coming and talking to me about Jesus, and that Jesus is God. And I say, well, Allah means God. So I know that Allah is the true God. And so as we start to argue kind of back and forth, I'm a young kid, but I really believe in this is my identity and my family of origin. And so as we keep going back and forth about this, he mentions two things which really just hit me so hard, which was, when he spoke to God, he didn't have to speak Arabic, that God would understand him, and that he could speak in English, and God would not only hear him, but that he would answer his prayer, right? And then he would say, man, I don't have the way that I pray is not dependent on a location. It's not dependent on me doing a certain thing. I can pray right now and know right here, even as I'm driving, and know that God would hear me. And there was such a relational aspect to that I had never experienced before, that made me curious at that time, but I was still kind of stubborn in the fact that this is what I was raised in, and this is who I know God to be. And so we got into a debate there, but it kind of set me thinking on some things. And I think that the other key part was I was able to watch his life. And so I not only heard him talk about Jesus and the difference that Jesus made in his life and how he could pray and have this relationship with God, but I also saw what his relationship with God was like. So I followed my grandfather into prisons as he did prison ministry. I followed him into nursing homes as he delivered groceries to elderly people. I also will see him go to his church and serve.
That's so beautiful, Tyree. What is it about how God deals with sin and forgiveness that drew you to Jesus?
Yeah. I think I really came to a clear understanding at that time. Not at that time, but when I got to college, I think that started my journey into understanding more about God. And I had tons of questions when I started to break away from Islam about what we practice and why we practice as Christians. And so my grandfather answered a couple of questions for me. He gave me a Bible and said, you have to investigate for yourself. And as I started to do that, I think what I still had, though, was from remnants of being a Muslim, was I still had this idea of I had to be a good person, right? I had to have my works outweigh my the bad, right? The good outweighing the bad. And so I think what the freedom that the gospel gave me is, once I had the conviction in college that, no, the good guy image that I had built up at that time seemed to be smashed, and my whole identity in being a good person was in pieces, and I couldn't put it back together. And it left me in a depression at the time when I was in college. And I felt like when I heard about, for the first time, the love of God, it was, well, right now, I don't even love myself, right? I don't even want to be here right now because my identity was built up in this thing, and now I can't be that. And so because I can't be that anymore, because I'm not this good person that I'm trying to be so bad, I don't want to be here. But if God loves me like that, like you say he does, then I want that. I want that because I don't even love myself right now. And so it gave me such a freedom to be able to say, man, if God can forgive me and if he can love me in spite of the fact that I don't even love myself right now, I want that. And I want to know more about that. God, show me more of this. And so when I heard of that, I called my grandfather immediately. I left the meeting that I was in and I said, I get it. I finally get it. And at that moment is when I understood forgiveness and I understood the gospel.
And you can find the full interview with Tyree on our YouTube channel, along with much more from CBN News. Just go to youtube.com and search for CBN News. Coming up, brothers in arms discover they are also brothers by birth. We'll explain when we come back. Stay with us. It's the story of a long overdue family reunion with some amazing coincidences. An adopted Army Major General served for 20 years before finding out his biological family was closer than he realized. Robert Edmondson reunited with his two half-brothers at Fort Knox in Kentucky. One of them also serves in the Army.
If I could sum it up in one word, that one word would be love.
A number of emotions came to mind. Number one, I was raised as an only child. So I immediately had siblings.
Edmondson's fellow soldier, now a younger brother, served in the same division, pledged the same fraternity, and get this, both their sons share the same birthday. They all say they are excited to have found each other. Sounds like a movie to me. I don't know what you think, but it sounds like a great movie there and a wonderful way to end Newswatch. That's it for this edition of CBN Newswatch. Remember, you can find more of our news programs on the CBN News Channel anytime or online with cbnnews.com. Also, tell us what you think about the stories you've seen by emailing newswatch@cbn.com or talk to us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Hope you'll join us next time. Have a great day.